Welcome back. So now we're going to talk about the components of design thinking. And design thinking is normally defined as a methodology or framework for conducting fieldwork that is used by designers to solve complex problems, navigate uncertain environments, and create something that is new to the world. And of course, when you're talking about creating something that is new to the world, it's really hard to do like your conventional hypothesis testing of, hey, I've got this great idea, do you like this or not? I mean, that's kind of wasteful, right? So what if you can try to observe what people will actually want before you start developing prototypes? Okay, this is very much an inductive or abductive form of reasoning. Accepting you don't know much, going out, exploring the world, and then kind of getting some sort of a rough idea, and then actually kind of doing a pre-test with your consumers to see if it'll actually work. And these are some things that you look at. So you focus on needs, emotions, and desires of your potential customers. And notice I'm saying of your potential customers. You're not looking at your needs, emotions, or desires necessarily, but rather of those that you are selling to. And these can be kind of difficult. That's why you have to be really good at observing and interviewing, and we'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later. But focusing on what people need, well, that's kind of tough. What do they need? I mean, you can ask them, what do you need? And I can guarantee you could have asked everybody in the entire world, what do you need? And they would have never said, I need an iPhone, until they actually held it in their hand. That's what we call a latent need. A latent need is something that you didn't realize you needed until you actually have it. So trying to pick apart what these latent needs are is really tough. Looking at people's emotions. They may not necessarily, through a conventional interview, express their emotions effectively. That's where it comes on you to actually observe your potential customers and see how they act, and then try to guess what those emotions are, okay? Especially in reaction to certain products. And you look at their desires. What are their dreams? If you can help people achieve their biggest dreams, or you can give them their biggest dreams, you've done really well. And again, you can ask them what their desires are, but they may not always know that. So that comes on to you to be the good interviewer, the good observer, and try to figure out exactly what those desires are and if you can actually provide that or not. Okay? Then you got to figure out desirability, and that's done by customer segment. There's a lot of businesses that, they may look at something, you say, okay, this is really great for the older crowd, but I haven't quite managed to tap into the younger crowd. What's it going to take to get the younger crowd? I've got the older crowd down. I'm not sure that design thinking is the best use of my time now. Doesn't mean it's a waste of time, but if you're trying to tap into the younger crowd, then you want to focus on your desirability here. Okay? Then you look at viability. Is this something that can be maintained in the long run, or is this something that's going to be kind of like a trend or a fad? Something that's really cool for 6 months and then it goes out of style. Or is this the kind of business that'll last for decades? And it's not that one's better than the other necessarily, right? And then you look at feasibility, and that's asking yourself, like, what can actually be achieved? What can I actually do? So let's give some examples to kind of illustrate how all this works in reality. So let's think about something simple like a coffee shop. I use coffee shops a lot because, quite frankly, I'm imagining you all are either actual university students or you're students of life, and so coffee shops are probably a big part of your day-to-day routine, or at least your weekly routine. Okay? So when you go to a coffee shop, let's look at what you're actually doing. Okay? You might go to the coffee shop and you're sitting there and you're looking at the customers. And so you see different customers and they're like, it's lunchtime, I got my coffee, but I'd really like something to eat, I'm hungry. So now I've got to go from one coffee shop to go somewhere else and get a sandwich. Okay? Let me give an example. So when I stay with family out in Arizona, there is this one place, and it's a coffee shop, and then they make breakfast sandwiches. Okay? Now, their breakfast sandwiches are probably the best I've ever had. I mean, these are fantastic. In the morning, I really need like a little protein to kind of get me going. So I went to this cafe, and it's bagels, coffee, and sandwiches. That's what it's known for. So great, I go, I get my coffee at the bagel shop, bagel, sandwich, and coffee shop that is. I get my coffee there, I get the sandwich, and I walk home. I get home, and I'm eating the sandwich like, man, this is amazing. And I try one sip of the coffee, I gotta spit it out. It's gross, right? I cannot drink that coffee. But quite frankly, in the morning, I need food and I need caffeine, okay? So fine, what do I do the next day? I pick out my sandwich, and I go next door because there's a Starbucks next door to that, and I get a coffee at Starbucks. Now, Starbucks has breakfast sandwiches too, but they're not as good as this place that can't do the coffee right. So I need both coffee and I need sandwiches. So if Starbucks sandwiches were as good as a place next door, I'd buy my coffee and sandwich at Starbucks. And if this other place had coffee as good as Starbucks, I'd buy my coffee and my sandwich there. Think of what they're missing out, because I need caffeine and I need protein in the morning. So they've missed out. And I'd be willing to bet you if the owners were doing a little design thinking, they would notice that I was buying coffee and a sandwich there, and then I was just buying the sandwich and not buying the coffee. And when I go to Starbucks right after, what do? I have my little bag with a sandwich in it. You can smell what's in there. And all the people at Starbucks go, that smells really good. But it never registers that maybe if they provided better sandwiches, I would eat those sandwiches there. Now, don't get me wrong, Starbucks has great breakfast sandwiches, but they're not as good as this place that's next door. It's probably the best breakfast sandwich I ever had at the other place. Okay? So that's focusing on needs. When you look at emotions, right? You think about what people are doing in a cafe or a coffee shop, right? Is the coffee shop somewhere that makes them relaxed? Makes them happy? Kind of like a place they can go and feel comfortable? Is it somewhere that makes them productive? Right? Is this somewhere like every time I go to this coffee shop, I'm ready to go, I'm pumped up, I'm excited to do my work? Like, what is it exactly, what is our emotional state? And how can you capitalize on that? And if you notice that people go to the coffee shop and they're kind of sad, you think, well, why are they sad? Well, maybe because you're playing like music that's associated with a funeral home or something, and maybe you need to change your music, maybe get something a little bit more upbeat or peppy, or maybe the art makes people depressed, the lack of light makes people depressed, right? So how do people react emotionally to the environment that you create in your coffee shop? And then you look at desires. Like and when I try to figure out desires, I actually do this through an interview technique. I ask people, I say, if you could have a coffee shop that will give you anything irrespective of budget, you could have it all, what would you ask for? And some people will say, I just want a good cup of coffee. So then I need to provide, focus on high quality coffee. Some people say, I want a place that I can take my dates. Okay, that's important to know, somewhere that's comfortable for dates. I need somewhere that can be my office outside the home. Okay, I need somewhere that, blah, blah, blah. And so those are their desires. And then you have to start thinking, right? I'm kind of go out of order, right? Then you have to start thinking, when you start looking at desires, you look at your feasibility. Okay, what can actually be achieved? Can I get that high quality coffee at a reasonable price? Maybe. There was a guy that gave a presentation for coffee, and he wanted to do something really wild and crazy. So what's the wildest, craziest thing you want for a coffee shop? I said, I want you to provide me Turkish coffee. And if you've never had Turkish coffee, you are missing out. What they do is they take sand, and they put it in like this tray, and they heat the sand, and they take the coffee in like the pot, and they stick it in the sand, and the sand is so hot that it makes the coffee boil up, and then they remove it and let it boil down, and they stick it in there, and that's kind of how it percolates. I said, make Turkish coffee. I would love to, it's fun to watch people making Turkish coffee. The coffee is really good, blah, 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 blah. Well, the problem was it wasn't feasible because A, he didn't know how to make Turkish coffee, and he didn't think the local audience where I live here in Texas would appreciate the Turkish coffee experience. So that wasn't really feasible. In fact, it wasn't feasible because he didn't know how to do the coffee, the Turkish style coffee, and it wasn't desirable because he didn't quite have his customer segments down. So he said, look, actually I don't know that it was not desirable because he didn't have his customer segments down. Let me go backwards on that. Is it desirable for his particular customer segments? And I asked him, well, who do you normally serve? He said, well, I've really got the student audience nailed down. He had like a lot of university students going to his coffee house. Okay, that's fine. Maybe that particular group of people doesn't need Turkish coffee. Instead, what do they need? They need somewhere that's quiet, it's got like some light jazz music, somewhere they can kind of talk softly, do their homework, stuff like that. But I said, when the students go away, what happens in your coffee shop? You say, well, I've got nothing going on. I'm losing money. But what if you did like special Turkish coffee nights so that you could attract some of the older generations or a different demographic, right? So Turkish coffee might not be desirable for young students, but it might be desirable for a different audience. And therefore, it might be worth overcoming some of these feasibility obstacles, like actually learning how to make the coffee, buying the sand tray, etc., right? Or hiring somebody that actually knows how to do it. And how sustainable is the idea? And we can mean this like environmental sustainability, but that's really not what we're talking about. Financially, how sustainable is it? So if you wanted to have Turkish coffee, his idea of making the perfect cup of Turkish coffee was bringing somebody over from Turkey, and kind of doing it just like they do in Istanbul. Well, that's probably not viable. It seems like that's kind of expensive, right? Versus, maybe he makes his own little sand tray apparatus and he kind of makes it himself. Okay, that's an example of something that you might see at a coffee shop, and one of my suggestions of making Turkish coffee at a coffee shop in Texas. And that's kind of, but you could do it for anything else too, right? You could say, well, okay, I've got another suggestion for you, guy that owns a coffee house. What if instead of making it a traditional coffee house just for students, what if you made it, a place for church and religious groups? I'm in a town with a lot of churches. So what, students certain hours a day, and then you want to tap into that religious audience. Well, what would that look like? We'd focus on needs. Well, do people that, want to have a religious service, do they need like a coffee house experience with it? Well, maybe you talk to some people who own churches, pastors or whatever, and determine, like, do you think that's a good idea? Would this augment your ability to execute religious services by having it at a coffee house and serving caffeine? Let's say they say yes, right? So then you look, okay, what would make you feel comfortable to have a religious service in a coffee shop? Well, you'd like, maybe a cross, or, a place that's comfortable for people to sit, where they're at ease with their pastor, they're comfortable, okay? And then what would you really like to have? What would wow you in terms of having a religious service at a coffee shop that's so good you steal people from the other churches? Well, maybe it'd be something like, in terms of desires, well, I'd really like, you to be able to set up pews and have an organ and, holy water and all this other stuff. And like, well, that's a little far-fetched. I don't know if we can get an organ set up in a small coffee shop. But you can at least keep it in the back of your mind. And then you look at the desirability. Then you start looking, not just the pastor, but also the people that go to church, and you start thinking, well, would these people be comfortable having their religious services at a coffee shop? Okay. Then you look at the viability, right? So if you close off your particular coffee shop for a certain number of hours per day or per week so that, different church groups can meet there, you're probably going to be excluding other customers in the hopes that you bring kind of the church crowd. Is that financially a good idea? Okay? Is it something that you can actually pull off? And then the feasibility. Can you actually do this? Like, do you have the infrastructure? Do you have the size of the building? Do you have the furniture? Do you have all the things that pastor needs to be able to conduct some sort of a religious service in your particular coffee shop? So these are a couple of examples of how these components of design thinking work. In the next videos, I'll continue talking about how this coffee shop example might work. And we'll talk a little bit more in the next video on empathy and design thinking. Hope these two examples are helpful. As always, hit that thumbs up, that's a like, if you enjoyed this video. Definitely hit that subscribe button, and make any comments you have down below. I'm looking forward to seeing you in the next video.